Hell Yes Life, episode 29. Welcome to the Hell Yes Life podcast, the show that helps you come alive so you can live a Hell Yes life. I'm your host, Norman Bell. Hey there, Hell Yes Lifers. Welcome to another episode of the Hell Yes Life podcast. I am your host, Norman Bell, and I'm excited to be here. I hope you are too. This is the place to hear inspiring stories and actionable tips from our amazing guests that will motivate you to live your Hell Yes Life. The Hell Yes Life podcast releases episodes every Tuesday and sometimes now on Thursdays and Fridays. And Hell Yes Lifers, if you want to write a review, please visit hellyeslife.com/HYL iTunes. Also, I encourage you to join us in our Hell Yes Life Facebook community, where we are supporting each other to move towards our Hell Yes lives. To join the community, visit hellyeslife.com/Facebook. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Hell Yes Lifers, today my guest is Dave Sanderson. On January 15th, 2009, Dave Sanderson was the last passenger off the back of US Airways Flight 1549, the plane that crashed into the Hudson River, which is best known as the Miracle on the Hudson. Dave was largely responsible for making sure that many others made it out of the plane safely. Hell Yes Lifers, you may be familiar with the film Sully, starring Tom Hanks, that was about the Miracle on the Hudson. That's the plane that Dave Sanderson was on. Now, since that day, Dave has gone on to become a motivational speaker and author. And currently, Dave averages over 100 speeches a year for major corporations across the United States as well as overseas. And in his presentations, he shares the lessons he learned during the Miracle on the Hudson, as well as during his 30 years in sales and sales management, and 10 years being on and leading a security team for Tony Robbins. And in his new book, Moments Matter, Dave discusses lessons learned from the Miracle on the Hudson and how one defining moment in your life can create a lifetime of purpose. In our conversation, Dave takes us through a firsthand account of the events of January 15th, 2009. We then discuss all the amazing developments that have happened to Dave since that day, as well as how he came to realize that every moment of your life really matters and why you should show up for the life that's in front of you. Really excited to share this conversation with you, Hell Yes Lifers, so let's dive in. Dave Sanderson, welcome to the Hell Yes Life podcast. Are you ready to tell us about your Hell Yes Life?
Hell yeah, let's get going.
All right, let's do this, Dave. Thanks so much for joining us. I always like to start off by asking our guests the question, what is your Hell Yes? By that, I mean, what is that thing that really makes you come alive and really lights you up?
Well, you know, what my hell yes moment is, and what really drives me is when I get to go out and speak in front of hundreds and or thousands of people and look in their eyes and see how they're impacted by what my story is.
Absolutely. I'm sure that so many people have been impacted by that story, and we're going to see if we can impact a few more here today. I want to just go ahead and dive in. I think anybody reading the description of this episode will know that you've got a story to tell about something that happened to you on, it was January 15th, 2009.
That's correct. That's the day that changed not only my life, but probably hundreds of other people's lives. And now with the movie Sully, probably thousands of other lives.
Can you go ahead and just take us into that day? Tell us that story.
Nothing extraordinary about the day, Norma. It was just one of the routine days, end of a 3-day business trip, trying to get home a little early, and we got done that day about 10 o'clock in the morning. We started at 5 a.m., so jumped on the earlier flight by way of my travel agent, which happened to be US Airways Flight 1549. Nothing extraordinary. You know, I gave up a first class seat at 5 o'clock for a coach seat to get home early. And then, of course, about, as we all know now, about 60 to 70 seconds after we took off is when the explosion hit on the plane. And what that explosion was a flock of Canadian geese hitting the plane simultaneously, knocking out both engines, which caused power loss. And from that point on, it was a pretty dire situation.
Take us there. Take us to that moment. So up until that moment, when you hear that explosion, everything's going as normal. You're probably just whatever you were doing at the time, and then that the sound, the impact of that hits. Take us to that moment.
Well, when the bird struck, I was in seat 15A looking out the window. I saw fire coming out from beneath the left wing, so I knew something had happened. But, I fly over 100 times a year, so I thought the plane lost an engine. No big deal. I felt him banking. I thought he was going back to LaGuardia. But as we know now, it was a simultaneous bird hit on both the left and the right engine, so it knocked both engines out, which basically deadened the plane. At that point in time, we were banking. I thought going back to the airport but we know now he was actually banking down towards the Hudson River. And as he glided that plane, skillfully glided that plane, Captain Sonberg did an amazing job. He had to avoid the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River, which I think doesn't get enough credit in the entire story, because he only cleared that bridge by about 400 feet. Because as we were gliding over that bridge, I looked down and I saw people's faces looking up at me. And at that point, I thought we were pretty much done. We were going straight into the river. And candidly, I never had seen an airplane go into a river with a positive outcome.
Oh my goodness, I'm sure. So can you, I just to slow that moment down a little bit,
Yep.
We'll be talking about everything that happened afterwards, of course, but what was going through your mind? And then also, what was the atmosphere there on the plane? I mean, did people know what was happening? Did people know that the pilot was trying to land the plane on the water? Was that communicated to you, or was it all just happened in such a quick flash?
Well, my mindset was, once he crossed over the George Washington Bridge, he said the only words he said the entire time on this plane. He said, "This is your captain, brace for impact." And at that moment, I think myself and I think many of the other people that I've spoken to who are on the plane realized this was a pretty serious situation. The captain used the words in interviews, dire. I used the word serious. I thought it was serious, but candidly, I didn't know how serious it was until he started going nose first down into the river. And at that point in time, it was it was so quiet you hear a pin drop on the plane. That's one of the things I think really was a save. I use the word saving grace on that plane, because no one lost control. No one freaked out. No one was screaming. Everybody, I think, was internalized at that point, thinking this is pretty well lit. I better get things squared away, either by texting or calling my loved ones and or getting squared away with your creator, which was exactly what I was doing at that moment in time.
Wow. So you really had that moment where you thought, this is it. This is the end of my life.
This is it.
And
yep.
How long did that moment last? Did that go on for several minutes where people were still just unsure of how this was going to turn out?
Well, from the time he crossed over the George Washington to the time of impact on the river was somewhere between 60 and 70 seconds. So literally it was a minute of the time from that moment, because what happened is he glided the plane, he had to keep up speed, and this is some technical jargon that I've learned over the last few years, but he had to maintain a speed of 120 miles an hour to keep the plane above the river. But as he picked the nose up to get it over the bridge, he lost that speed. So as he got over the bridge, he had to put the nose down to regain speed. And of course, you put the nose down, you're heading straight into the river.
Wow. Okay. So then what happened?
Well, when he hit,
we kind of know what happened, but take it.
Well, when he hit, it was a hard hit, and I went back in my seat and back forward really quick. It was like a really jarring hit. He estimates, I've heard him hit on the interview, say he hit between 100 and 120 miles an hour. So it was a hard hit. But when I hit, I came back up, and as soon as I sort of got back up from going back and forward, I looked up and looked out the window, and I saw light in the window, but I also saw water immediately at the window level. So I knew that we were alive, but candidly, here's where everything started for me. I think pretty much all the passengers at that point in time was, getting out of a sinking plane. And, that the plane was taking on water immediately because of the way it hit. The bottom of the plane was sort of stripped off, and then someone listened to the flight crew and tried to open up that back door, and water started coming in the back door immediately. So now you got water coming in from underneath the plane and water coming in from the back of the plane. So depending where you were on that plane, I was towards the back. I was a C-15A. Water was anywhere from ankle knee to waist deep pretty much immediately. So it was coming in rapidly. And at that point, the term I've used in the media many times was controlled chaos, where people were moving fast and there was a lot of excitement, but no one was losing their heads. And I think that was, once again, part of the outcome that doesn't get talked about a lot. Of people, the passenger makeup of that plane really caused people not to lose their heads, but focused on the outcome.
Wow. So yeah, there was something collectively where everyone managed to keep a certain level of calm that might have not have been the case in similar situations, but obviously that boded well for everyone there that day. Okay, and so then tell me a little bit more about. So there you are. You're at the back of the plane. Water is starting to fill up the plane, and I think you've talked in some of the interviews I've looked at, or in your maybe in your TED Talk, about what was going through your head at that time, right?
Yeah, well, my game plan initially was pretty much probably like everybody else in that plane: get to the aisle, get up, and get out. But when I got to the aisle, something happened to change that perspective for me, and it was my mother, who had passed away in 1997 when I was a child. She used to tell me, and probably my sister and brother likewise, that if you do the right thing, God will take care of you. And one of the great things, Norman, about my mother is she would never tell us directly what to do, but she would give us a choice, and hopefully we'd make the right choice. And the choice that I made was, you help other people first. I grew up in teams and all the time in sports and athletics and Boy Scouts. And so I went towards the back of the plane to see if anybody needed help. And once we got everybody out from the back of the plane, I started making my way out of the plane. And of course, at that time, water was about waist deep to chest deep. Bins had broken open and luggage is floating in the water. It's dark in the back of the plane. So every time I took a step, I hit something. And candidly, I didn't know what I was hitting at that point. I didn't know if it was just a piece of luggage or somebody was still there, but all the further I could get up was 10F. And that's when I started trying to make my way out of the plane, is when I got to 10F like everybody else. But when I got to the door, it was an amazing sight. There was no room on that wing or the boat for me. So that's why I was inside the plane waist deep in 36-degree water for about 7 minutes, holding on that little lifeboat as close as I could to that wing to keep it close. And that's how I became the last passenger out of the plane.
Wow. So there you are. You're waist deep in 36-degree water. At that point, are you still thinking, I don't know if I'm going to make it out of this, or does it feel like there's a bridge to safety here?
Well, there's adrenaline running, and I think that's what I tell people. And I've talked to EMTs and military folks and fire and policemen, and they all sort of mimic the same thing. Is when you're in that moment, it's adrenaline. So at that moment, I was just focused on, looking at what was going on and assessing when I could get out. But, that moment came for me a few minutes later when I felt a shimmy on the plane. And when I found out later, after talking to the gentleman who owned a tugboat who hit the front of the plane, that's what caused the shimmy. Of course, when a tugboat hits the plane and it's you're waist deep in the water, and all of a sudden the water starts sloshing back and forth, and all of a sudden, my first thought was, this plane's going down, man. It's like Titanic. This thing's going down, and the one thing I remember from that movie is you don't want to be stuck inside it. Inside of a plane going down. It's you want to get out, and that was the moment I said, all right, man, it's time to get out of here, time to go, and that's when I jumped in and start swimming to the closest boat that I could find, which happened to be the end of that wing.
Wow. So you jumped into the water. There was no room on the wing, and so you jumped into the water and swam to the closest boat.
It was about 7 minutes inside the plane, and when all this was going on, and all of a sudden, that's when I felt the shimmy, and that's when I jumped in and swam. And to this point, I know how to swim, which I give credit to my parents for making me learn how to swim. It's one of those lessons in life that these things, all these, I talk about my book, Moments Matter, all these moments in your life that you don't think mean anything, all of a sudden matter. In that one moment that you learn something when you're 9 years old, all of a sudden, you're 40 years later, pays off.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Just getting a little bit of shivers just thinking about that. I mean, even what you said before about all the team sports that you played growing up, and you just had this mentality of you know, it's probably just a part of your way of being as working together on a team, right? And so that in that moment, you just went into that kind of instinctive way of being and helping the other people off the plane. That is amazing. So then, you know, I just want to make sure that we touch on, you know, such an amazing story. I want to hear all the details from you. Then what happened? So then you're out of the plane. Did the plane sink?
Well, the plane is sinks totally to the bottom. It was immersed when about 24 minutes. The only thing was sticking out was the front of the plane. I've seen that picture that was taken from one of the ferries of the plane's nose basically sticking out of the plane. So it was underwater, not to the bottom, but underwater within 24 minutes.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So then, so you're safe and you're headed for safety. Then what happened?
So I headed to New Jersey. I went out to the right side of the plane, and the right side of the plane was facing towards New Jersey. And I found out by speaking, it was the gentleman who wrote the plan for maritime rescues of the Hudson. He and I spoke together at a conference in New Orleans, sort of a plan execution type of talk. I learned from him was part of the plan was, of course, wherever closest point to shore you were going to go is where you're going to go. And I was heading towards Jersey, and at that point, fortunately for me, there were two EMTs and a gentleman from the Red Cross with a blanket ready just for me, because I found out later they radioed ahead to tell them there were people in the water and they needed help, and I was one of those people, and they carried me to a triage center, which I was assessed at that point. That I had needed to go to the hospital because my blood pressure was extremely high. It was 190 over 120, and my EMT made the call to take him immediately to the hospital. And that's there's a lot that happened at triage center, but that's how I got going to the hospital so quickly, is because of my blood pressure. And when I got there, that's when everything started really happening for me.
Wow. Yeah. And I don't think anyone would be surprised that your blood pressure would be up after an experience like that. So you get to the hospital and you said that's when things started happening for me. What do you mean by that?
Well, the doctors there, I had a group of nurses, because when we got to the hospital, the gurney got stuck in the ambulance, I found out later. So that's why I had about 10 women pick me up in blankets and carry me to a bed. And all of a sudden the doctor's yelling out orders, blood pressure and oxygen and temperature. And I found out that's when they found out my temperature was 94, and they diagnosed me immediately with hypothermia. And that's when, things started happening where all of a sudden they're going after me, trying to warm me up, sort of shake me up a little bit, get the blood moving, because pretty much everything south of my heart I found out was pretty well frozen from the conditions. My stomach, my abdomen, my kidneys, my intestines. So it took about 5 hours to warm my body up, and those 5 hours I got to meet a lot of the authorities who had a lot of questions, and the media was there, and that's when things really started happening for me.
Wow. So there you are. So yeah, it makes sense if you were in that water for 7 minutes that you would be, your body would be experiencing those effects. Wow. Anything you can say about that part of the experience? So there you are, you're safe. You're warming up. It looks like you're returning to health. But then you're being barraged by the media, by, police and so forth. What is that like? I mean, it must sounds overwhelming.
It was overwhelming. I think, the hospital folks did a tremendous job in Palisades Medical Center, but as they told me later, they weren't ready for that kind of onslaught, and they weren't ready for all that kind of exposure of not only the authorities, but media. And all of a sudden you have the governor of New Jersey coming in, you have directors of Port Authority, you have high level people coming in, because one of the things I found out later after all this sort of settled down was, the reason and if you saw the movie Sully, it sort of played out that way. It took them a long time to identify where everybody was, because a lot of people who got to shore just started going home because they lived there. And so there were two of us in the hospital, and they could find us. And this is why I think Barry, who was in the hospital with me, who was the first passenger out of the plane, if you saw the movie, he's the guy who represented the guy jumping out of the water in the front of the plane. We were in that hospital together, and that's where they could find us and start asking questions. So that's why I think he and I were barraged a lot, because they could find somebody who was actually in the plane, because everybody else started going home, and the crew and captain were locked down doing their things. So that's why we got, I think, so much attention that night.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That is amazing to think of so many people just kind of swimming to shore and then heading home, like, well, I had a funny thing happen this morning, but then, yeah. And so that's kind of a question for you too. So, were you in the hospital for several days? Were you just there for the day? Were you already headed home by the end of that day?
No, I had hypothermia and my blood pressure was still skyrocketing. And the media was there, and we agreed to do all those TV shows the next morning. But the authorities still had a lot of questions, so I was there overnight until I got through my media that I did the next morning for ABC and for Good Morning America, an early show, and then I was feeling pretty good, and I wanted to go home, and my person from US Airways, who was my liaison, her name's Doreen from Pittsburgh, she flew in overnight to really take care of me, to take care of anything that I needed. She was tremendous. She was trying to make plans to get me home, but she wanted to put me on a later flight. But I wanted to get out of there, man. I just want to get home. And so we had a very interesting way of how I got out of the hospital and got to LaGuardia quickly, which was a business card from the director of Port Authority left and said, "Call me if you need anything," and we did. And we used his networking to use his facilities to get me from Weehawken, New Jersey, to LaGuardia in about 16 minutes to catch the plane back to Charlotte. And it was quite an experience just getting from there to getting back on a plane. And then, of course, the plane, everybody wanted to talk to you, but the flight attendant, Beth, took great care of me. She made sure no one really got to me. She was like my protector, and that's how I got back to Charlotte.
That is amazing to think that you had to just get on a plane so soon after going through that experience. Did you have any sense of, and this is to get into a little bit about what you're generally talking about now with post-traumatic, you call it post-traumatic growth syndrome, but, just as any PTSD, just getting on a plane after just going through an experience like that?
Well, I tell people, I was just being moved around that day. Candidly, I was probably pretty out of it. And they would just tell me where to go, when to go, and people were sort of handling me. The real challenge getting on a plane, Norman, was the next week when my company asked me to fly to Michigan on a business trip, and that was pretty dicey. I have to admit, I'm glad I did it because, candidly, if I tell folks, they tell you got to get back on the horse, you got to get back on the plane, or you may never get back on it again, and that's what happened to me.
So in a way, you were lucky that, just for the fact of the work that you do, you had to get back on the horse or back on the plane.
If I didn't get back on a plane, I would have lost my job probably, and which would have been more devastating.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about what has happened since. So, what happens when something like this happens in a person's life that completely changes everything in a way? It sounds like in a way you went back to business as usual after that, but then obviously things developed to kind of go in a different direction for you.
Well, business, I agree. I think that my company thought it was business as usual, but when you go through a traumatic life event like this, business is not usual. And I think that's one thing my company didn't realize, and they should have realized, and they could have realized, which would have maybe helped me a little bit more, because they thought just go back to work and everything's all right. But when something like this happens, man, you've lost everything, lost pretty much all your business stuff, right? You come back, you're the media, you got media attention. You still have, questions coming from authorities all over the place. And then people are wanting your time. So there wasn't a lot of, back to business as usual, but I tried to. But it was interesting. The company that I was serving that day in Brooklyn, I was there for and supporting, they were very supportive. They were there to support me and my family tremendously. And I really give them a whole lot of credit because they realized the impact it had on my life. But, I went to church that next Sunday, and of course, everybody wanted to talk to me, but I was asked to speak the next Sunday for the men's breakfast, and I thought it was no big deal. Bunch of old guys eating pancakes. I've seen it before, so no big deal. But that's the day it changed everything in the direction of my life, was that next Sunday after the plane crash.
And what did you talk about?
Well, I candidly didn't have anything prepared. And all of a sudden, they had 500 or 600 people show up at our church. They ran out of pancakes, and it was like, people were hungry. They were upset that they came and they didn't get fed. And here I don't know what I'm going to say. And I just did a prayer. I said, God, give me something to say. Give it to me now. And he gave me something to say, and I said it. And, what happened at the end of the talk, everybody wanted to talk to me, and a couple of guys were up there talking to me. But this elderly lady came up to me, Norman, and I hadn't ever seen her at our church, and she's probably 80 or 90 years old, and took my arm and looked me in the eye and said, I was questioning if there was a God, and I don't believe in miracles, but you're physical evidence that there is a God, and he does miracles. And she said, thank you. And that was the moment I realized, it's something I impacted somebody's life by just being there. And I said, maybe I have a different calling. And that's what opened up my eyes. Maybe there's a bigger mission for this, for me on earth. And that's what started driving me to say, how can I impact people's lives? And I can do that by speaking and writing books and doing other things and helping people who may have started questioning why they're here. What are they doing here?
That's amazing. That's amazing. And so, yeah, I've talked to other guests about this. It seems like we all have kind of helpers along the way, right? So you had that woman at the pancake breakfast that came up to you and told you that, and that was like a sign for you, like,
right.
Wait a second, maybe there's something more that I can give back here. And so then what happened? What happened after that? How did you decide? Okay, what am I going to do with this experience? What am I going to talk about and focus on as far as, what I would speak about?
Well, I was still working in my business. I was still in sales. I was a sales producer. And, that year I actually was a top sales producer in the company in our division, which was really amazing with everything else going on. But one of the things that, as I was doing that in the previous 10 years, I was the head of security for a gentleman named Tony Robbins. And Tony was very supportive of me, took me under his wing, was coaching me the entire way of what to expect, how I could basically work and tell this message in a way that could help impact people's lives. So he was coaching me about the media and the messaging and all that. And so as I was putting sort of my thoughts together, he was coaching me, and I started speaking more and more just randomly when people would ask. I had nothing, prepared, but I started, getting more organized around it, and I took what Zig Ziglar said to heart because I'm all into personal development. Zig was one of those people that I would listen to as I was, growing up in my sales career. And, he said before he started speaking for money, he did 175 to 100 talks for nothing just to hone his craft. So I did the same thing. I just sort of modeled that and went out and started speaking to people who wanted me to speak to them, and I did that, all over the country as I was working and as I was trying to still have a family and still trying to do everything else.
So you're really kind of honing your message there, and obviously getting great support. I think anybody listening to this would know who Tony Robbins is, the great personal growth master and coach and speaker. So tell me about that. So what were you doing for Tony Robbins? You're the head of security, is that right?
That was correct. For 5 years, I was assistant head of security, and then for 5 years after that, I was the head of security, traveling with him, making sure he could do what he needed to do and support people the way he needed to be supported, and making sure that could happen all around the world. So I was very blessed to have that kind of friendship and relationship with Tony.
Wow. And so when he obviously became aware of what had happened with you on the Miracle on the Hudson flight. Were you in contact with him soon after that about, what you could do about, speaking about this and so forth?
That's not the way it transpired. The way it transpired was he was the only person that called me in the hospital that night.
Oh,
he tracked me down. He got on the phone, and while I was in the bed and still recovering, still on all the things people, doing their things to me, he and I were talking on the phone, and he did a little video that night about that conversation, which went viral, which I was really blown away by. But, after that, he just asked me to check in with him whenever I needed something. And I was actually heading to LA 2 weeks later to do all these TV shows. And he was in Palm Springs, and he said, call me when you get out west. And I did. And he and I had about an hour conversation. He was coaching me on what to expect and how I could help sort of focus my talk in a way that could impact people's lives. And that's how it started, from him calling me in the hospital bed that night in New Jersey.
Wow. And so again, just to point back to that, there's little guides along the way, there's helpers, and wow, what a great helper to have in your court, none other than Tony Robbins, right? So let's talk a little bit about, and by the way, Hell Yes Lifers out there listening, we'll have a link in the show notes to Dave's TED Talk, where he talks about post-traumatic growth syndrome. And at the beginning of that talk, there's some footage about the Miracle on the Hudson event, and then also a message from Tony Robbins. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, that's about 30 seconds of the 5-minute video YouTube clip that he did. Yeah, most definitely.
Oh, okay, great. I'll have to check out the longer version. So tell us a little bit about a couple of things. One, this phrase, post-traumatic growth syndrome. And then your book you also have written a book called Moments Matter. So let's touch on both of those, whichever one of those you'd like to talk about first.
Well, let's talk. I'll talk about post-traumatic growth syndrome first, because it was a topic, candidly, normally I never heard about until a few years ago. And then I got a phone call, requested an interview with me from AARP magazine, and candidly, I thought I was too young for it anyway. I wasn't 50, and it's like a bunch of old people. What could I add value to that? But the gentleman who said there was a group watching from UNC Charlotte doing a study around post-traumatic growth syndrome, and they used me as a sort of a catalyst around that study, and they wanted to talk to me on that subject. I told them I knew nothing about that subject, so I can't add any value. They said we found out that you helped raise over $8.5 million with the American Red Cross. You've used this traumatic experience to good. Tell us the strategies you did. And I did the interview, and all of a sudden just started developing around, this is a strategy on how to grow from a traumatic life event instead of going to a depressed state, like so many people did. And as we found out in the movie Sully did. So this term came out, and I started sort of researching it and talking a little bit about it here and there. But last year I was asked to do, I was really focused on doing a TED Talk, but I was rejected, like so many people are when they do the application. But all of a sudden I reworked my application around this subject, and no one ever heard about at TED. And they said, yeah, I was offered to do many TED Talks, and I selected the one I did in Canada about post-traumatic growth syndrome and what it is, how you can grow from a traumatic event, and what's a couple strategies that I used to be able to do that. There are many other strategies I talk about in my longer talk, but I talk about the two strategies on how you can grow from a traumatic life event is managing your state, and the meaning you attach to something equals the emotion of your life, and emotion is your life. And that's how I sort of frame it in my TED Talk. So it really has opened up a whole new avenue for me to be able to connect with people in a very, very positive way who are going through a very traumatic life event of their own, whether it's a fire, a flood, a health scare. I'm talking to a lady in Canada now who was in Mount Everest as part of that landslide they had a couple years ago, when she was one of the few people that got out, and she's now having guilt syndrome. So I get to talk to so many different kinds of people because of that one article, that interview that I did 3 years ago in AARP magazine.
Wow. So and again, talk to other guests about, when you really put yourself out there in your hell yes. And obviously this was something that was kind of thrust upon you, obviously with this event, but you've really turned it into something that is an act of service, right? And so when you're doing that, life kind of the universe seems to come up and meet you, and unexpected occurrences happen, like this article in AARP leading to all these other things. So it's kind of amazing how life works that way sometimes.
Well, it does, and that's what opened up the avenue to do our book, Moments Matter.
Yeah. And so tell me about that phrase, moments matter.
So how that came about was a couple years ago, and I had a personal assistant there. Her name was Vicky. I went down the street to help a couple neighbors. They were two older ladies. And, when you're a neighbor and, you have older ladies, they need some help. You fix your TV or come in and hook up their, whatever. It's because you're a neighbor. So I went down and helped them with their TV, and I came out and they asked me if I want some milk and cookies. And of course, I'm not going to say no to milk and cookies. So I'm sitting there waiting for the milk and cookies, and I'm looking through some of these albums they have on their table, and there were pictures of concentration camps. And I started looking through them. I said, "What are these?" And they said, "Well, we were there. That's our parents and us." And they showed me their forearms and where the numbers were on their forearms. And I said, "Man, you've got to record this. This is something that history needs to be recorded about this." They kept saying, no, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. So I told Vicky this, and Vicky said, you need to tell your story and record your story for your grandkids and great grandkids because you're not going to be here for them to hear it out of your mouth. So we spent about 9 hours, Norman, recording minute by minute of that couple day period around the plane and what happened that day and the whole situation. And we realized there was a book about it because all these about 12 lessons and strategies I used that day to not only help me and help others, but hopefully I used in sales likewise in business. So as we were writing this book and we were trying to figure out the title, and one day I was talking to Cindy who helped me write it, and I said, one of the things I realized by doing this process that all these moments in my life mattered, that I never thought that it mattered, like learning how to swim. And when I was in Boy Scouts and having to do this thing to order the arrow, and all of a sudden I had to swim with my backpack across a river to get to the other side. All these things these moments mattered in my life, that all of a sudden showed up. And as we all of a sudden realized that's the title. All these moments that you're in your life that you don't think matter, ever thought would mean anything, one day they may save yourself or save somebody else. And that's how the Moments Matter title came about, because, all the moments that day for everybody on that plane. Sullenberger talks about it in the movie and talks about it when he's interviewed about those moments when he was, in the Air Force Academy, learned how to glide a plane. And when he was growing up, in Texas and having to learn how to fly, and how he was given the responsibility to take the plane over. All these moments that you don't think matter.
Now, one question I have about that is what I was thinking when you were saying that is, but that is absolutely true and very poignant to think that all of those moments that happened in your life unexpectedly, right, ended up mattering in that moment. But that's not something you can really plan for, right? I wouldn't want to think about, okay, you got to think of all the different possibilities of everything that could happen to you and then start to try to prepare for them.
Nope.
It doesn't work like that, right? So it's,
no.
Yeah. Is there anything to say? There's not an action to take here, is it? It's just more of an observation that, hey, even these things in our lives that we think might not really amount to anything could end up mattering a lot down the road.
That's why I thought, one of my favorite quotes, and I use this when I speak, and I actually in my TED Talk I talk about this, is that those who have the humility to prepare will have the confidence to execute when your moment comes. And it's all about, this taking the time when you're learning things to do it right and learn how to do it. Because, when that moment comes, and I say in my TED Talk, and I tell you, everybody I talk to, everybody in this life, whether it's you, me, anybody, it doesn't matter. The president, whether it's the, prime minister of Israel, it doesn't matter. Everybody's going to have that moment in life when they have that personal plane crash. Something's going to happen. And you're going to be faced with making some very tough choices on how to go forward, whether it's a financial, emotional, or relationship, like so many people have now. And it's all those things in your life that you prepare for, all of a sudden will give you that confidence to make the correct decision for you and when that moment comes.
I just want to imagine that there might be somebody out there listening now that maybe has gone through something like that. And like you've said, you can go a couple ways here. It can become a growth experience, or you can go down into a depression. So what sorts of things, what kinds of things can you do you tell people who have been through something like this?
Well, when I do my mentorship and talk to people, I say everybody has their seasons of life, and every you have your winter, spring, summer and fall, and all your seasons are different in different parts of your life. Where you may be in a summer a part of your relationship, but you may be in a winter when it comes to finances. Right. So you may be depressed on this end and really growing in your relationship, but everybody's got their seasons of life. And it really starts, I tell people, it starts with you. It starts with you and what you focus on, because what you focus on is what you manifest. And it's proven over and over. It's like a fact of life. If you really focus in on something, you can get the outcome. If you model somebody else who's received the outcome that you desire, do exactly what they do, you'll also get that outcome. So it starts with focusing, and it all starts with me. It starts with what you focus on, and what you focus on manifests itself, and what you really want to make it happen. And that's how I think you prepare for these moments. It's not because you just go say, okay, I've got to prepare for a plane crash. It's because all these moments that you have build your confidence up, so you're ready to handle that moment.
Right, right. So this is about really preparing for life, whatever life brings.
Right.
Be it, it could be a great opportunity, and you need to be prepared for that as well, and for situations like this, right?
Correct.
If you're in general preparing for life, you're preparing across the board there. I wanted to ask you this. So I always like to ask. So I mean, obviously, gosh, you've been through an amazing experience with the Miracle on the Hudson event and everything that's happened since then. I always like to ask our guests, looking forward, is there, what I like to call this is your cringeworthy vision for your Hell Yes life. So this is not that there's anything wrong with your vision, but that it's a vision so big that it makes you cringe to think about sharing it. Is there something that you think about that when you're looking forward that you would like to do in the future?
There's a lot of things I like to do, but the one thing I like to really have, and I really haven't even spoken, I've talked to a couple people about this, and I want my own plane. I want to be able to fly. I want my own plane. I want to be able to go wherever I want to go. So those moments that I want to do, whether it's I want to go to Alaska and see Alaska, I have the freedom to be able to do that and have the resources to be able to do that. So that's that one thing that, I can see it. I don't know how I'm going to get there. And it definitely makes me cringe if I tell anybody, because they go look at me and say, how the hell are you going to get that? And so it's that moment. I think that cringeworthy moment for me is, man, I love to have my own plane and be able to have the freedom to do what I want, when I want, where I want.
Oh, I love that. Thanks for sharing that with us, Dave. And there's something nice about your story. If you did get there someday, to have gone through the experience you went through, and then you said, you know what, I'm gonna fly my own plane someday, right. as opposed to shrinking away from air travel entirely or something. So that is awesome. Let me ask you this. I always like to ask: is there any one quote or resource that has helped you along the way that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think I shared the quote is, those who have the humility to prepare will have the confidence to execute when that moment comes. That's my favorite quote that I really go back to. I believe, Norman, in personal development. That's how I got to where I was in sales and everything that I did. I became a top producer in every company that I was with. And it's because I think I invested in myself. And, one of the things I learned from Tony, and I'll give him all the credit because he put it in my mind back in the early 90s, is about net time. And he said, what's net time? Well, it's that no extra time you have. What do you do with that no extra time? And what I try to do is I don't listen to tapes anymore. I listen to, what's online right now. And that's how I do my books and sort of pick up these nuggets so I can impact other people. So it's that net time that I really try to help people focus on, that no extra time.
Yeah. It's like every moment of our day we can fill with, good stuff or, not so good as it turns out. So that's great. So, where on the internet can we find you?
Well, I love to interact with people, and the way I do it, and you can get to me directly, is my website at davesandersonspeaks.com. I have a way that you can get a hold of me, whether it's verbally or whether it's in writing. So please check it out there. You can get copies of both books. The first book was Brace for Impact, which I was a contributor to, so I don't take much credit out of that. But my other book, Moments Matters, there, and that's where I start putting some of the my blogging and some of the details around the backgrounds of how this whole thing came about and how it can impact people's lives.
Awesome, Dave. And we will have links in the show notes so you can access Dave's website from there, Hell Yes Lifers. Well, Dave, to close out our time, I want to say, first of all, thanks so much again for being on the show, sharing your story. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot out of hearing that. But I would like to say hell yes together on the count of 3. Are you ready to do that?
Let's do it, boss.
All right. 1, 2, 3.
Hell yes.
Yes.
You got it, man.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Hell Yes Life podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite RSS feed. If you like the show, please leave a rating and review. And if you want to stay connected, visit hellyeslife.com and sign up for the e-newsletter and private Facebook group. Again, I'm Norman Bell. Thanks for joining me. Now let's get out there and live a hell yes life.